very much. So thank you. If we had tried maybe a few months ago to find a date when it would work for me to come, it probably would have taken 6 months to converge on it. But I think Moore sent me an email, I don't know, a week and a half ago or something like that, and I was going to be in New York for some personal and work reasons, and it worked out beautifully. So thank you, and it's a short visit, but better than negotiating over the course of 6 months to find a date. I first met Moore. I don't remember how we got to you, but I remember where we met. We met in one of the best Coupa Cafe in the middle of Palo Alto, the place where you hear all the tech startup conversations happening. And it was with, very important to mention, my 2 primary collaborators throughout that stuff. Actually, I am not capable of doing anything on my own. Once a year I run the LA Marathon, and my explanation is that I have to try to do something on my own once a year, but it's a ridiculous comment because if you know how marathons work, you have people all along the route giving you water and everything. That's not even on my own. But I have had great fortune and some really wonderful collaborators. I just want to mention Mark Hansen is another, person who spends a lot of time in New York. He's a statistician, also has an appointment in our Design Media Arts program at UCLA. He did Listening Post and designed the base of the new lobby of the New York Times headquarters, and he works a lot with New York Times R&D. Strongly recommend you get him out here. Statistics is sort of core to everything, and not something I realized so much when I was first putting together the center, but became very clear shortly thereafter, and he's been essential. And then Jeff Burke, who is has an appointment in theater, film, and television, actually, and is a combination of arts and electroengineering, computer science, whom some of you know as well. So all of this is highly collaborative, it's highly multidisciplinary, and it's very applied. So one thing that has definitely happened to me over the course of my career or time in academia, which has been for a long time now, and I don't know whether I've changed the world that many times, but I have that many times lost interest in what I was doing and became interested in something else. And what has also happened over that time is what interests me are things that are increasingly applied, but similar in a sense in the way the internet stuff started rolling out in the early days, which is where I started, in that it lends itself to a lot of iterative deployment, data collection, and moving on from there, and letting your systems sort of teach you what's useful and what's not, and moving forward. What's the difference between sort of the first part of what I did around internet protocol design and all of that is that back then I was very much in the lower part of the hourglass that you see right over there on the right side of that picture, and I was far away from applications, and really at that time in the network protocol world, people who did applications were sort of people who couldn't do protocols in that rigid sort of computer science, even applied computer science side of things. We used to accept application papers to SIGCOMM as sort of token papers, but they had to come in on some kind of an affirmative action basis. And that has entirely turned around, I think, for a lot of the field, and definitely for me, in the sense that it's, when I started doing work in distributed sensing, what sort of wireless sensor networks, what in retrospect was obvious wasn't clear to me at the beginning, but became very clear, which is that to do wireless sensing, distributed sensing outside of the context of what you were going to use the data for didn't make sensible applied work. You do very theoretical work, but I have great respect for theoreticians, but I've just never been one. So if you're doing applied work, then the reason I built the center was to bring together in a ongoing way the people who wanted to use new types of data collection and instruments in their science and in their work. And that became increasingly important to do, and I became increasingly connected and interested in application and social innovation as much as technological. with that as an introduction, what we've been doing for the last part of SENS, we are terminal as of July 2012, as Science and Technology Centers are. It's a fantastic NSF program if you haven't done one. I know DIMACS was one, it was long enough ago. Highly recommend that program, but it is terminal and it hurts when it ends. But in our last several years, we've really worked more and more on things that and applications where the mobile phone has been the center of that. And I'll talk more about why this focus on mobile devices, and does it have to be a mobile device? Can it be a wearable device? As I go through the talk. And so we did work in participatory sensing, and then increasingly, although not exclusively, the work has focused more and more on things around what's called mobile health, and a particular aspect of mobile health. So now, so mobile health and mHealth is not my term. Existed long before I started doing work in the area. And so it's worth just explaining that we're only working on a part of the space of mobile health. And so if you want to say, what is this space of mobile health? One dimension of it is this: who's using the mobile tool? Is it the end user? So you can call them the patient, although this is just as much for well people. We don't know what to call these entities, right? In the US, we like to call them consumers, which is perverse, but anyway. So is it the patient, which is the word I'll largely stick with, even though it's not perfect? Is it the clinician who's using the mobile tool, or is it some intermediary? So starting at the right, most of the work in mHealth, and the people who first coined the term, were people who do excellent work in emerging countries where they're making use of mobile infrastructure in the hands of field workers, community health workers, to extend the reach of systematic clinical care and tracking. And so you have community health workers, you have nurses, clinicians who are tracking adherence or immunizations and so forth. Very good work, largely not what I'm going to talk about. You can also think about mobile tools in the hands of the clinician. So on an iPad or on a phone, being able to get to the electronic health record. So, you know, the typical story they tell is they don't have to leave the golf course when they get a call, or when they wake up in the middle of the night, they can give better advice, right? To respond to an emergency. Very important stuff. It's a very clear extension of enterprise health IT. It's very actively been being pursued by commercial industry, and I think it's, and it is also not what I want to talk about, right? So mobile health can mean many things. It can be on the hands of the clinician so that they can get access to health records. I think of that as an extension of electronic health records work. What I do want to focus on is the mobile in the hands of the patient, and across the range of applications of that, particularly focused on the combination of self-care and clinical care and research. You can think about just using a mobile tool as part of some data gathering in association with a clinical trial, and it has not, and without it having anything to do with how clinicians might help to treat patients, or patients might do self-care. And that kind of isolated just as a research data gathering tool, it's also a perfectly fine thing, but not what I'll be focusing on. And I will tend to focus on functionality that really plays out on smartphones. So great stuff happening with SMS, but not what I'll be talking about. And we can have that argument if you want to later. It's a combination of different types of data that I'll say more about. And so sometimes I just qualify it by saying participatory mobile health to capture the fact that it's about the patient using it who's participating in the data collection, but also participating in their care. It's really very much aligned with a lot that's been going on in the world of consumer health, Health 2.0, patients like me, quantified self. My first time, actually, I was giving a talk at a pharmaceutical company yesterday. And they'd never heard of the term quantified self, which was sort of interesting. They had only one person in the room had ever actually knew of the website Patients Like Me. Struck me as very odd. I'm sure that's not the case here. And so just social media generally. And we're also very focused on chronic disease. So why chronic disease? Because that's where the burden and the opportunity for observation is really in the hand of the patient. So it's hard enough to make any of this stuff really matter or be important, right? And so I like to go for things where there's, at least from looking at it, the logic of it, that it looks like you could really make a big difference, not where the difference already starts out being like maybe you could make a difference on the margin. So this is, in chronic disease management, there seems to be so much missing data about what people are actually doing during the course of their everyday life, because they're not in a clinical setting, that there seems to be a big opportunity there. And it has some real strong motivations behind it. Some of these statistics you might or might not know. So a large portion of US deaths and increasingly in other countries as well are actually caused by lifestyle behaviors, so diet, smoking, and sedentary lifestyle. That it's increasingly, it's actually about comorbidity, which greatly increases the complexity of treatment. So more than 50% of every person living in this country has at least one chronic disease. And that's not every patient, it's every person. And it's increasingly that you have comorbidity. You have diabetes and hypertension. And the complexity of then managing and treating those things is much more difficult. Age of onset getting younger. And then a really interesting report out of the World Economic Forum just end of last year, that over the next 20 years, somehow they calculated that non-communicable diseases, okay, not the malarias and such, are going to cost worldwide $30 trillion, and an additional $16 trillion for mental health. So big potential for a big size of the problem. What kind of a dent we can make is another thing. Okay, so the last sort of preparatory setup. This is a crazily overly wordy slide because I just made it. It takes a long time for me to move slides into actually being somehow visual or something. So don't get nervous, it won't be all this way. But as setup, this is sort of, you know, you do that thing where all the questions and missed assumptions and all those things that you can always get somewhere down into the talk, you try to put up front to preempt them. It never really works, but that's what this slide is. And then finally, target demographic. Apologies to anybody in the audience. There was a high-level manager at this pharma company that didn't like that I made that cutoff just for poetic reasons. I say 15 to 55, and he held up his iPhone. And anyway, but this is, I do not think that this is really the right deployment path necessarily for the greatest impact for elder care. And elder care is a very important and interesting and all of that problem, but the elderly population is more place-based, and I think place-based technologies are more relevant, and they are not generally, there are exceptions, they are not generally digital natives. This is an entirely opportunistic move, this thing around looking at mobile health. Participatory sensing, it's all opportunistic. It's all that these devices, not just the infrastructure has been laid out across the globe, and we're riding on the economics of that, and we're riding on all the people, the commercial entities that want to sell you things through your phone that brings down the, you know, how much of the cost you have to pay for with these new applications. But people have chosen to spend their discretionary income till the very end, right, of their income, not their life, right, on these mobile devices. They're important to them in the way they manage their lives and their social interactions. And so for me, it's to go with that demographic, not to try to get people to use a smartphone, but to get people who are using a smartphone to use it for these sorts of things as well. So the last number I saw at end of 2011 was something around 43% and growing in the US were smartphone based, which is again why I'm just going to focus on that and not text messaging, and not any RCT based or large scale studies, but in things we've done, and this is a LA specific reference, but sort of from Beverly Hills to Boyle Heights, you don't see a digital divide, right? Except by age. So you can, you know, if we just look at Los Angeles School District, which is a place where we do a lot of exploration, you walk up to a high school student at random and you hand them a smartphone application and they have, generally no trouble and an interest in using it depending on what it is. Okay, so what do I mean by participatory mobile health after that setup, right? It's this leveraging the mobile phone to help to capture what was previously ephemeral. It's not like you don't know how you, well, in some cases you might, you know how you feel to different extents. You know those physiological measurements. You're diabetic, you check your blood glucose, that determines what you eat or don't eat or how much insulin you take. But there's a difference between knowing something at the moment, and which is more ephemeral knowledge, and actually having that contribute to a data stream. So all of our work in participatory sensing was really just building on photo voice and experience sampling. Techniques from the 80s, from social scientists, at just a time before the technology was right there, right to do it. It's really just a combination of photo voice, experience sampling, and then taking advantage of the background recording of data that we can also do. So I guess, bring in sort of this, the notion and the religion of analytics or something into that thing of really pulling information off that digital exhaust. And a lot of the work is in the analysis of it, and depending on what you're doing with it, the visualization, pulling out the sense making, if you will, from it. And that's what I'll be talking more about. Let me just give some example use cases, because things in the abstract don't make much sense to me. Some of these are, number of these are sort of these composite. These are the things I wish I was funded to do. Only the last one. We've done a number of other pilots. I can tell you about those. No one of them is, they're also opportunistic. Where could I find some, you asked before, where can you find like this health collaborator who has some money, has a population to do a pilot that you can actually do something with? You have to go, and then you end up with pilots that aren't just the right ones. These, to be truth in advertising, they're a compilation of the features of some of the pilots we've done. Not the last one, the second to last. So pre-diabetic woman with hypertension, there you have that comorbidity issue, and you have both medication adherence as well as the need to try to titrate, because you have side effects from medication. So a high blood pressure medication, once you have high blood pressure and you're told to take medication, it isn't curative. The medication does not cure you. So you don't take it for a certain amount of time like an antibiotic and then stop taking it. But I think the statistics as of a couple years ago was that 60% of people stopped taking their high blood pressure medication after 6 months for various reasons. One of the reasons is that the disease itself is not palpable. It's called the silent killer. It has an effect on your body, but you don't feel it having that effect, whereas the medication itself can cause dizziness and uncomfortable side effects. So what do you do as a normal human being when you can't feel the disorder and you feel the side effects? You drop the meds. But that's not the entire reason. But it's one of those stories which comes in many times that drives people to want to titrate medication. Titrating being that optimization process to make it work for you. ADHD is a very good example. I particularly think it's a good example when you talk about young adults. If you're looking in this space, young adults, I think in general, are very interesting target population here, because they don't have the parents and they don't have the family structure that comes in some other form, perhaps later on in life. And so ADHD tends to rise in childhood. It's managed by the parents, and then suddenly you're not with the parents. And so, the executive function makes the whole notion of managing things, like remembering to refill doses, sticking to sleep hygiene, which is a very important part. There's a lot of behavioral things as well as medication. The medication interferes with sleep. It's a complex thing to actually get right. And another example where the meds are no way curative. They don't cure it all, they just help you treat the symptoms. Inflammatory bowel disease is a very interesting one as well, because there's so little that's understood about what actually causes flare-ups. And these things can, Crohn's disease and such, can really be if not managed, actually life-threatening and very serious, but many, many people live with managing this disease. Another example like that is multiple sclerosis. It used to be diagnosed late in life. Now it's diagnosed early. People have very active lives, but they tend to have flare-ups 2, 3 to 5 times a year. And as you can imagine, if you were a young age adult and you have these flare-ups, you're trying to figure out why. What triggers them? Is it stress? Is it diet? Is it environmental? Or is it something that has nothing to do with one of those? And everybody, you build hypotheses that are based on that are not necessarily based on data. Okay, and finally the last one I'll just talk about is the one we're actually doing most recently is with the VA. So the VA, I'll say more about it later, but they built some tools for returning soldiers to help them manage. It's all about self-management with post-traumatic stress disorder, and in combination with depression and sleep disorders, which often come along with it. And I'll say more about how this self-care tool can become a part of clinical care. Okay, so those are a range of examples you can have in mind. We have a study going on with, and you put it up here, with new moms at risk of cardiovascular disease. Diet, stress, and food intake self-monitoring to see how effective that is in helping them lose weight, which is a very important risk factor in cardiovascular disease. We have a small ADHD study going on. We did some work with the impact of stress on breast cancer survivors. We have something going on with HIV positive and risky behavior, and another 3 that I'm forgetting. I'm pressing the wrong button, or it's not letting me advance. Wrong button. Okay. Across all those things, the ones I wish I were funded to do, the ones we're actually doing, and when I talk to people all around what they're doing, there are some 80% is always the same. It's the same subset of the same tools, which is great from somebody who's interested in infrastructure and reuse of components, because you learn a lot, and wherever you learn it, it can apply across other things. And that's, I mean, that's what this is all about. As I said, it's all an opportunistic move, and it's all about the potential for scalability and affordability. And what makes it even more scalable and affordable is that the techniques used from one condition seem to have a lot of application to other conditions. So the basic data types basically fall into 2 types. There's self-report, the 2 blocks on the left, and there's automatically captured data, the 2 blocks on the right. Location time-triggered surveys really is just a modern form of experience sampling. So, but now you have, because the phones know where they are, and you can have reasonable interfaces that you associate those things with semantic places like home and work, not just some lat long coordinate. You can create the logic that is time and place based, right? So trigger me to answer the survey 20 minutes after I get home, kind of a thing. And it's just basic. Sometimes I just refer to this as like mobile survey monkey, right? It's effectively, but it's short, to the point, in the moment, as opposed to being a retrospective recall. And if you are working with folks from the health sciences field, there's a step of methodology development to do here, which is that they're standard instruments, because they do use patient-reported information. You come in, you give a history, you give an update. But all the current instruments are not designed to ask daily, let alone maybe twice a day. So you go to an NIH-funded researcher, and they go into a panic because they say this will never get funded by study section because it's not a standard instrument, and so you get into this, it's this valley of death problem between sort of what could be done and what NIH believes is ready to be funded to do a large-scale study, and a lot of this stuff falls into that gap. So location time-triggered surveys, easy to do, nothing that new there, but you do have to create and study and validate the instruments you use in that place. One of the things the phone top buttons is a form of self-report, came out through focus groups from our NIH mom study, the one I just mentioned. And when we talked to the moms about to get their input on what this thing might look like for diet, stress, and exercise self-monitoring, every one of them said, don't ask me lots of questions when I'm stressed. So what came out of that was that instead we have a phone top button. Yes, thank you. We have a phone top button, and it's just, they just tap it, and it records time and place. So you get a little heat map of your stress, time and place that you can then come back later and annotate. Same thing, dietary intake data collection still is a huge problem, and I have no solution to it. I just did an avoidance of that hard problem with this thing by just saying, let's just look at, see if you can note the times when you're eating out of turn. If somebody asked you at the beginning of the day, what are you going to eat today? All the things that don't fit into that, right? So the people in diet and nutrition sort of call it unplanned, off your diet, whatever the term would be. And so see if you can catch that snacking behavior. We also just did a button for that, which optionally you can do a picture or annotate with a quick tag. But again, if you're trying to see where your out of unintended eating is, you might see where your snacking is, and that idea being that maybe then you plan around it. So not everything is technological. All of this is more a way of building tools that help people in that context with some of that behavior change. Okay, the automated stuff is things that I'm sure you've read and heard about. It's been going on for a long time. Actigraphy, mobility data, some great early work out of Intel's lab in Seattle, and Anthony LaMarca and those folks who did a lot of early work making use of GPS traces and Wi-Fi traces and other things to infer physical activity. Are you walking, driving, running, sorts of a thing? Although for most of US population, really all we need to know is, are you actually walking or are you sedentary? That really is the important dividing function. If somebody is running, they don't really matter. I mean, they're okay. It's like, this isn't the problem. We use, and there's a big community of people who've been working on these problems for a long time. It's a good thing to learn with. I wouldn't start a thesis on it. It's sort of like starting a thesis on MAC protocols after the Ethernet standard evolved. It's just sort of done. But it's a good learning place. And it's great stuff to use. So we use actigraphy, which comes off the accelerometer and the radios and GPS, and we still struggle with energy management. And again, a good place to write a paper, do a project, but probably late in the game to start a thesis. And then we use mobility data. So mobility data is more like the data from which you could say, what time are you getting up and getting to work or school? Are you isolating on the weekends, or are you getting out and about? What are those mobility patterns? It doesn't have anything to do with your physical activity. So I separate those out. And finally, and I think an increasingly interesting and important side of this is these phone-based activities. So you can give people tools for self-management or diagnostic exercises to do on the phone. They're not self-reporting. They're doing things like for our ADHD work, they're doing a go, no-go game. So letters come up quickly, randomly. They're supposed to tap it unless it's an X. It's a measure of impulse control. One of the big factors in ADHD is impulse control. And the data off of how they do on that game becomes part of that diagnostic data stream. Something else called PVT, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's a vigilance test. Similar idea. And they've used that very much to see the impact of, not for ADHD, but the impact of sleep disorders and sleep disruption on your ability, your sort of cognitive function. And so what's interesting about the device, it's with you. It's not just when you're come into the doctor's setting to do this thing, but how does your cognitive function varying during the day? Playing a little game generates some kind of that data. Using relaxation tools generates data. Texting, communicating, all the digital exhaust off of how people are otherwise using their phone becomes important to the data stream. So we use those data sort of conceptually. I'm most interested in it in the way that the VA is doing it now. That what you do is you build a tool for the person. You build a tool for them to self-manage. And then you pull off the analytics and the data from that to inform, and there's processing you got to do there to make it clinically useful and glanceable and all of that. You use the data from their self-care to inform clinical care. And then you derive from that what you can learn more about in terms of evidence of what works for individuals. So health researchers like to build tools for them. And then they have to worry about how do you get people to use it. And it only serves that research study. So what I like about this approach that the VA is taking is that there are just some people that were said, we have this huge problem, right? We won't go into the why do they have this huge problem. Let's accept the problem as it arises, right? With returning soldiers with increasing incidence of PTSD. So they wanted to build tools that people could use for self-management in between therapy sessions. And from that, bring data back to help the clinician treat them. And from that, learn more about what works and what doesn't, and why it works for some and why it doesn't for others. So, you know, how do we do this now, right? It's informal, ephemeral records that the patient tries to keep in mind, and then when they come to a clinical context, they report it in some way. People form casual and, well, I mean, we do it all the time. We form casual and flawed hypotheses all the time. I noticed you had on your shelf Duncan Watts, Everything's Obvious. Want you to know the answer, right? Wonderful book of stories about how we do this all the time. And so can we, and then also just prescribe behaviors. You might very well know exactly what you should be doing to be healthy. That doesn't mean that it's achievable. The head of a hospital at an unknown institution that I won't mention, I mean, described this stuff to him, sort of gave me a dismissive look and said, all we have to do is make it expensive to be fat. Which is I just will make clear to me if that was true, then anyway, there's so many things that don't make sense about that. I said, haven't you ever known anybody who knew very well and wanted so much to be able to get their weight under control and couldn't? But in any case, these things are hard to do, and particularly in the food environments and the affordable food environments in which we live. That's the discussion about serving pizza, right? Because it's affordable, but it's horrendous. Anyway, sorry, I'm not being polite. I'm not being polite to my hosts. But believe me, it's nothing personal. It happens everywhere. It's not the first time I've given someone a hard time about that. You didn't give me a plastic water bottle, so I couldn't chide you about plastic water bottles. So clinician undersamples generally the processes they're trying to manage, right? Depression. You walk in, you get an initial set of meds prescribed to you. How the doctor comes to that original decision, we won't even worry about that, right? Whatever that initial condition is. They start conservatively, right? You're not supposed to overtreat. And they start off of what's known from an RCT, from a randomized controlled trial, about what dosage works on average better than others. They choose a med regime, they assign it to you, you come back in 2 or 3 weeks if your health insurance is good. And then they say, how are you feeling? And I tell the story all the time, and somebody said it to me at this farm yesterday. It made me very happy. Well, how you're feeling at that moment could have as much to do about whether you found parking or whether you had an argument that morning. As we know, it's completely undersampling the process. And so what can we do to bring better data to that process? There is no way to get systematic data in a usable way. And even and over time, as we develop evidence, instead of doing everything from randomized controlled trials and then knowing what works on average, and so having that influence what our priors are and making the decision about how to treat, maybe there's a way to generate more systematic information for people themselves about what's going to work for them, which if I don't keep talking so much, I'll get to. So have to say, this is not just about mobile apps. It almost has nothing to do with mobile apps. That mobile app is just, I mean, it's everything about the mobile app is all about HCI and usability, and there's lots of cool stuff to do there. And that cool stuff will continue to roll out. And so you want to be agile. If you're going and doing this stuff for real, you want to be able to build in the cool techniques. But the sort of sticky point in the problem, people are pretty good at that. There are a lot of good designers around. People are doing, there's almost more innovation on that part of it than we know what to do with. Because to systematically make use of this in health, you have to do the sense making, the data analysis. And that part has to be really a co-innovation, very multidisciplinary, with people who know something about health. It might be the patient group that's formed on patients like me and has been running for the last 3 years around MS, right? It's not, but it might well be people who actually understand the disease. So, so this example from PTSD Coach, I had nothing to do with this application. I simply had the fortune to convince them to work with me after they'd already done it. So this has been downloaded, who knows how much it's been used because they don't collect data from it. It has been downloaded 40,000 times since its release, maybe 6 months ago. And it was what's really good about it is it was designed by a group of clinical psychologists who what they do is treat returning soldiers. They have some standards of care around a cognitive behavioral therapy treatment for short-term addressing. They come in for a weekly appointment, and what their model is, you have to give them tools that are portable, meaning they don't just work in a therapeutic setting, to try to address their symptoms between sessions. And so they built an application that reflects the same kind of homework tools they've been giving to people, but it's now digital. It helps to remind them. It's more interactive, and it's also doesn't allow you to cheat and fill in all the sheets right before you come into your next therapy session, right? You know, it's not that it doesn't allow you. You just can see if somebody's not actually participating. Well, you can see it if you get the data. So these people are smart and they know their stuff. And why in the world did they release an app that doesn't collect any data? Because it doesn't. Well, they did it because they're smart. And if they wanted to release an app that collected data back from the veterans, they were going to go through, I don't know how long of an issue around privacy and security with the VA. So they released this app. It's being used. It's been downloaded by people around the world, and it doesn't have anything in there that's specific to returning veterans. So it's been now being used and explored in other contexts for trauma. We are using it as a driving case for this open mHealth nonprofit thing we're doing, which is sort of some, you know, it's a mini version of some combination between the IETF and Apache, or it's sort of open source, community-driven moves. I'll come back to it later. But we said, okay, so as experimentally the VA was fine with us doing a research project, where we call it PTSD Explorer, where we now plumb the app. The app stays the same, but now we pull the data off of it. What are those data? What tool are they using? When are they using it? What's their symptom severity that they self-report when they come into the tool and when they leave the tool? That was all part of the tool anyway. What do they say about coping and substance use? These were all things that are asked or that come out as part of using the app, except for the things around sedentarianism and social patterns. So we capture the data, we do some feature extraction and some trending, and we produce a little clinical visualization, and we're just starting in pilot in March to see, can the clinicians use this in an effective way when they're walking in to see a patient? Does seeing some synthesis and summary of what they've been doing over the past week as compared to the week before or over their history, can they use it effectively to better treat their patients? Very specific, but in some sense it's just a specific version of the story that I've been building up to. And the challenge there is, how do you summarize this data around in a certain way that's actually going to be useful and actionable for the clinician? I'll just put in a side note. Through our previous years of doing these sort of iterative, finding partners wherever we could to try to do mobile health applications, we built this thing that we call Homage for no particular reason. It doesn't stand for anything. And it is open source. We're delighted if anyone to use it. And it's basically, but there are other versions of the same idea, which is that you want to be able to script an application, and that is a combination of prompted self-report and background data, and you want that stuff time-stamped, geocoded, uploaded to a server, and have some base analysis. And that's what everybody sort of needs to get started. It's not what you take into production, because the app doesn't look, it's sort of like we do things in software. We do things in software, and then we do VLSI. and then we do an ASIC, right? You don't go right out from an idea to building a special purpose chip, right? You do stuff in software, and then you use a reconfigurable chip. And it used to be the reconfigurable chips were sort of really just for exploration, and then they started appearing in products, right? Because things would turn around fast enough that it actually wasn't worth doing a special chip. So analogously, the idea is that we're really in exploration. What works? What are the techniques? How do you pull a biomarker out of a physical activity trace? And this is for that kind of early exploration. Wrong arrow. We designed it so that the health innovators, right, the docs or health researchers we work with, it was easy for them to author the survey, to make it look like SurveyMonkey, more or less. And it was easy for them to see the data. And we insist that nobody do anything without figuring out what they're going to do with the data. They have to define some basic data analysis before they start collecting anything. Because, as you know, right, you go through that process and you fix a lot of things about what you're going to collect. And we try to make it so that while we're in no way commercially competitive in terms of this stuff, this is not Angry Birds, right? We are not Zynga by any means. But we just tried to make it so that as people are exploring, they do something that's usable, right? There's always that problem, right? What are you productizing and what are you perfecting? In this space, you have to have something that's at least usable, but you don't want to be perfecting something that isn't actually effective health-wise. So try to find a balance here. These are the trials we've actually done. I'm not going to spend time here. I mentioned some of them. And a lot of we have a paper actually to describe some of the focus group discussions. And of course, you have all those cultural differences, right? So in the mom study, you can take a picture of the food. When we talked about this in focus groups to our local demographic around LA, from all socioeconomic status, the idea of taking pictures to help them do some self-reinforcement was absolutely of interest to them. Some folks from Northwestern are using this as part of a study of immigrants from India, women who tend to become gain weight, be sedentary, to see how this would help. They were like, why would we take pictures? To what every single person they interviewed thought it was ridiculous to be taking pictures of their food, because they were still largely preparing dishes that they don't need a picture of. It's the same preparation that they've done and that their mothers did. And so a good source of that kind of reminder about obviously cultural context. Reminders, tremendously important, and also feedback. So I'll say more about this. Have you guys read UbiFit? Know about UbiFit? So smart reminders, just to say that you can have these things be not just time-based, but semantic-based. So you want to be able to give people a way to identify easily their important semantic places, and then be able to talk about their triggers in terms of those, not just GPS coordinates. So we don't do this well, therefore the pictures are other people's, right? So user engagement is hugely important. To bother putting out an app that doesn't give the person something back, where they don't see their data and what they're doing reflected back to them, it isn't even going to work for very long, and it's not the right path. At the same time, things haven't really advanced very much beyond UbiFit, which was, it's not 10 years old, but maybe it's getting close. It's 5 since publication, okay? It was done on PDAs. There was no such thing as smartphones. There was no geocoding then. Great project by a whole group of folks from Intel and UW, James Landay, Senna Consalvo, it was her thesis. And, read the paper. The ambient display made all the difference in that study. And now there's some really good work. Tanseem Chaudhry, who I mentioned you before, who's now at Cornell Information Systems Sciences, I don't remember which department, is also doing good work. So here you have the ambient display being driven off the physical activity, the social interaction, and the light exposure of the person. In the UbiFit, you had reaching your physical activity goals would grow, as determined by pedometer entry, would grow flowers in your garden. And the week it went clear, except that was very frustrating to people, so they introduced butterflies that hung around in the background. It's a great, very solid piece of work, and we still do a lousy job of it. When you go out and do these things, you want to have people use their own phones. So this is one of these everything's obvious, and as expected. But since we have a little bit of data on it, I decided to show it to you that it really does matter. You don't want to, if you can get away from buying phones and giving them to people, you want to do it. You want to upgrade their phones. And with HTML5 and mobile web and such, you can increasingly manage to do your software in such a way that it can work across multiple smartphone platforms. This software is intentionally not novel. We just built it out of existing pieces. While our stuff largely works on Android, we're working on an HTML5 version so that between HTML5 and PhoneGap, it will be able to work mobile platform to the extent that the platform supports it. So as iOS increasingly lets you do background data collection, we'll be able to do more of that. OK, so let me get to the last part of this talk where I want to make a few points about things that we're doing that's happening and things that we're not doing that should be happening. I thought might be particularly relevant here. So let me focus on the second part of the list. All the things associated with user experience, persuasive technologies, engagement. This is just a great context for that work. And it's so in need of it. And it will be the make or break thing that causes this stuff to be useful or not. Energy management, and there's still some work to do probably around how you do the software and hardware management on the mobile device itself. There's some nice work from Nadav Aharoni, who just is finishing out of Pentland's group at the Media Lab and going to Google. As he calls, is the only thing I don't like about his work is the name. It's called FUNF, and I don't know how to say it, but worth looking at if you're looking to explore in this space. Energy management, God, I thought I was getting away from that when I left wireless sensor networks, and I didn't. And it's still a challenge. It's within range, doable, but if you do it brute force, you don't get adequate lifetime. And privacy. So, and I think that the things here around privacy are all about usability, right? The hard problems are all going to be around usability. You can come up with ways in which you want to let people selectively share their data that are not necessarily usable. And there are people who have been working on this problem. So Ramon Caceres, who's at AT&T, and Monica Lamb, and student of mine who finished her thesis in this area, but we never did this really seriously enough. And now Dawn Song at Berkeley has a project going on that I think has some enough oomph behind it and funding and people who have enough of a security pedigree that I think we might get some progress. OK, so what are we doing that are still some open things so that I can finish up before the pizza? This is a picture that sort of comes back to that bigger context again. There are mobile health applications where the interaction, the type of data. There's the sense making that I kept emphasizing. That's where you have to work with the clinical folks to come up with how do you turn this activity trace into a depression marker? How do you get from that raw time series to the feature extraction to the right kind of aggregation over time? Are you looking at daily, or is this hourly? Are you trying to look for diurnal patterns? And then how do you make that a meaningful marker? Is it percentage time sedentary? Is it the midpoint of sleep, or is it the time somebody goes to sleep and the time they wake up, and whether that's shifting a lot? Figuring out between what you can measure to process into something that matters health-wise, and then doing a tool that's going to do the right kind of in-person variance. Because most of these things are not supposed to be, they're not a biomarker that you go across the population and say, if you have a value of 1.5, okay, then you're okay, right? 1.5 or below, and above that you have a problem. It's not that. It's that these are tools that let you say, for this person, here is their baseline, not medicated versus medicated. Here's their baseline when they're adhering and when they're not. When they're having when they're in a state of their MS is flaring up and when they're not. So fatigue, depression, other things like that. A lot of interesting and multidisciplinary work to do there. The second point I want to make here is that this is a place just calling for modularity and a lot of iterations. that are driven off of, well-instrumented systems that are generating analytics. So in those stories, I just in one sentence combined MS and depression and attention deficit and maternal health and so many components of this, particularly as you're lower down in the stack of processing the data, overlap. If we go into each of these things monolithically, and especially for that one application, obviously we're going to get a lot. Less far and slower than if we do a lot more of this modular, shared, and iterative design. It's in such an exploratory stage that you just know it has to be iterative. These are new type of data that people haven't dealt with before. But it's not rocket science, and it's not huge data, and so we should be able to do lots of iterations and start small and scale up. I forgot to say that. So in all the problems I've tried to work on, everything I do is a result of a previous trauma, okay? I try to do problems that scale down. So scaling up is very important, and it's what we always talk about, except for the hardware guys who try to make things smaller. Oh, there's the pizza. Yes, 1 minute.
Inside or outside? Outside.
But scaling down, if you're doing experimental work in you're not at a big pharma, you're not running an NIH center, right? And you're trying to explore, you can't explore at large scale, right? You got to explore at small scale. So you want a problem that authentically works at small scale. So if you're interested in the contagion of, the epidemiology of contagion, how flu, propagates through a city, well, that's a great thing to be interested in. But don't take that as a driving project to iterate on, because you have to have a significant percentage of your population instrumented before anything like this is going to help you, right? If you're interested in traffic flows, and like what Waze did, if you don't know what Waze is, cool startup, right? What Waze did, a number of people, and Mobile Millennium, right? A number of people had looked at said, the GPS off of my phone in my car gives you an indication of how fast traffic is moving on this street that isn't otherwise instrumented. It's a great idea, and it's not an easy one, it's a rich one. But how do you explore that? Like, you have to be, right, so what's his name? I'm forgetting. The Mobile Millennium guy from Berkeley. French. Anyway, I'll come back to me. But he rented 250 rental cars and a whole bunch of Berkeley undergrads and had them drive, up and down the highway in the Bay Area and he did great work. It's great stuff. But you just can't do a lot of that. So taking problems where you have to have at least, Waze has found like 1 or 2% penetration in an urban area, gets you enough data to do a good job. But I can't get to 2%, 1% penetration in LA or any subset of it. So choosing problems where your technology intervention is working and helping that individual, and that individual in their clinical care lets you get guidance and correction. You don't have to make up a whole bunch of the problem. So if you're doing applied work, the less of the problem you have to make up, the less likely you'll, yes, I know I have to end. So I just want to mention why we bothered starting this open mHealth was because my roots are in internet and open source, and a great book, by the way, as I was mentioning to more, was Weber's The Success of Open Source. I only discovered it like 6 months ago. Somebody showed it to me. It's a book from 2005, and I think it's a great, great, great piece of work, and has helped me back up this phrase I now have to tell to everybody, but not here. But you should know that the rest of the world needs to know that open source is not socialism, right? You got to say that to people. They don't know that the commercial systems and services and things they use have large numbers of open source components in them. And the reason you do that is because as a commercial entity, in an area where you can't do everything well over time, it makes sense to make use of open source components where you have a community of folks banging on the commodity stuff, not your secret sauce. And the commodity stuff gets better by a whole bunch of people, and you're sort of future-proofed against having to do it all yourself. So if we can, as a community, take the open source, the components that are more commodity among us, then you squeeze that innovation of all those silos so that you get a lot more innovation at the top of the bottom. And that's what the internet did. It chose a simple architecture to standardize on for how you interconnect networks, and allowed for then proliferation of what happens up above in the transport and application space and in the underlying technology space. And I I think that the metaphor can apply here as well. I don't mean open data. I don't mean you have to open up your commercial process. I just mean open source, open architecture. I don't have to tell you that. And this is the last thing I want to say. So my colleague in this, Ida Sim, she's a medical faculty MD from UCSF, and other people from the area have been working on this notion of personal evidence architecture, or N-of-1 studies. So to bring in a systematic way to do something that complements randomized controlled trial studies. And because does it work on average doesn't help so much when you are the one who has to figure out which to choose. Do I choose an over-the-counter antacid, or do I choose the new drug from the pharmaceutical? Do I choose the generic, or do I choose the specific one? On average, so if you're choosing to get an appendectomy or not, it's not reversible. You can't do this kind of N-of-1. But in some things you can. You can go on a systematic regime of choosing one dose. And some folks have started to do this. So some folks at Cincinnati Children's now do this routinely. They use one drug for a period of time. They take them off. They put them on another drug. They do symptom reporting and all those things. And then they decide what's best for them. And this is something that should be increasingly able to be a part of how clinical care happens, let alone research. And I promised you I would stop. And privacy, huge, and I have nothing great to say about it. We did a small thing. I mentioned the good people before, and then just my some of my favorite reading recommendations. The first one I recommend to health folks because I think they can learn about analytics and personalization and things that they should be doing. But it's a good read. I'm done.
Thank you. Questions? We'll take a couple.
Yeah.
So you managed, you mentioned the energy management problem.
Yeah.
Is it mainly because of the human-computer interaction, or is it the background services?
No, background services, entirely background services. Sorry, I wasn't clear. Entirely, yeah.
Are you at the point yet where you can measure efficacy?
So just to play with the semantics of it, I think what this is richer for is to measure effectiveness.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Just showing off that I know the difference between those terms.
Okay with effectiveness, comparative effectiveness.
Yes. I think that this is a tool for measuring and adapting to effectiveness. Okay. So in its bigger piece. Okay. But in its other piece, meaning how does a mobile health intervention, such as a behavior change one, how effective is it? It is as effective as the behavioral design. So I don't think that it's about measuring really. The mobile is just the medium that gives you back a lot of data on whether it's working, right? And the question is, does this particular regimen around supported behavior change work or not? And there's no one answer, right? People look at different approaches to supporting behavior change, for example. Or, but now let me be less wishy-washy. So a woman, Quinn is her last name, from University of Maryland, came out with one of the first published studies around the efficacy of doing adherence reminders for diabetics, and had very good results. So it's starting to emerge, those data around effectiveness. But it's not the mobile by itself isn't effective. It's the intervention design. Yeah. And what I think is interesting here is that you don't have to do a separate evaluation because it's all on a digital plane, self-reporting. It can really let you get interesting information directly from it in terms of its effectiveness. Yeah.
I would argue that the mobile device itself is a component of the intervention and making significant.
It is a component and it is significant, but the content of the intervention is hugely significant. I don't know that I would bother trying to isolate out the mobile or not because, well, how else are you going to do it? Like, what's the point? Yes?
Do people design interventions differently because they have mobiles?
They better, or it's not going to be very good.
Okay, so there's...
But some people don't, right? They try to do that same, but you have to redesign your instrument to make it work, and you have to calibrate it. It's part of the painful process of it. Yeah?
Where is the primary care doc in Oakville?
So in all my pictures, that clinical care loop, wherever that was, right, is the primary care doc. So anyway, the clinical care, right? So if the client, if they're prescribing, if they're suggesting somewhere, right, clinical care, that's the primary care doc, or it's the specialist that they send you off to. So.
What about the educational record? I actually do a lot of
Yeah.
research in the primary care practice.
Yep.
I can tell you that none of the docs are thinking about it.
No, but you know, until we figure out what works and such, I mean, first of all, I think you have a distribution. To some extent, I think you do have some docs who are thinking about this, and they can't find any study or anything to base it on, and what they think about is going and starting a company, or they go and pay somebody to build an app. And they are thinking about it because they sort of give their, they ask, even though they're not supposed to, if there's something going on and a wound isn't, or somebody's dealing with their eczema, they say, send me an MMS. Send me an email with the photo attached, even though that's like illegal to do. And so some of them are thinking this way, but until it's something that you can quickly use in their very few minutes, and really until we move in political or whatever other kind of bias here, until we have a rational healthcare system, we're not going to have rational, health tools making a lot of sense. So this all works in the context where people are trying to manage health, not trying to optimize individual treatment and don't have fee for service and all of that stuff. It doesn't really fit in that context. I don't mean to be glib about it. There's a lot of work to do there, but I do think that will be success or failure. Yeah. Michael, okay. You were going to ask something before. Michael, wait. Okay.
One of the things that worries me about the electronic medical record world is the tension between best average recommendation and most likely to be best for this patient. And I'm afraid that the flood of new EHR data is going to be replied to with a flood of insurance companies saying the best average treatment for this condition is X, and if you do anything other than X, we're going to pay for it. And so what I'd really
Yes.
like to know from some of your experiments is for which kinds of problems is it important to personalize the treatment for patients, and for which kinds can you get away with saying, well, tell everybody with diabetes to eat a lot of these vegetables.
Right. So that is a powerful question. And somebody was telling me yesterday at this unnamed pharma company that I guess there was just a couple of papers out in the Wall Street Journal that there is this flood of this data. And because it's sort of all aggregated together without adequate differentiation, there are lots of things that can be concluded from it that are all of this on average thing. Like that the generic is just as good as some brand name. Now they're biased in concluding this, but that the generic is just as good as some brand name. It depends what you aggregate over and if you differentiate things. I think that is a very important concern that we should try to get ahead of. I don't have an answer to your question about which, and I don't think that I would be the one to have the answer to the question. I think people who really understand those diseases have some physiological and empirical basis on which to say there's a reason why this would begin to differentiate. Now the role, personalized medicine tends to invoke genomics, which has largely had some impact in certain parts of cancer, right? It's going to be a lot, and they should continue all that funding of all that work because over time it will lead to things. But in the meantime, what we can start to do is get more information about phenotype, and based on what people know about the disease, know if it's an entirely generic recommendation or more specialized. So certainly in things related to mental health, because they understand so little of it, so much of the data is all around self-report, that is a place where the people who know about the conditions do feel that there's a huge amount of the role of the phenotype and the role of the environmental factors that come into play. I don't know if people understand multiple sclerosis that way, right? I don't know if they understand diabetes that way yet. I think this is just an opportunity to start to manageably get that kind of data.
So one more and then maybe one short one.
So, my question is the following.
there are current pilot studies that uses these technologies, smartphones, current technologies to implement some form of contingency management, some form of behavioral steering, like giving rewards. In other words, are there pilot studies?
I mean, that's what UbiFit was.
Not just to collect data and process.
No. Yeah, that's what UbiFit was. So that oldest study I referred to was a model of that. And there are other, there's work that's continued as well. Look at Massive Health. Okay, they came out with an app that they call the Eatery, right? And so, and if you look at the stuff that Mr. Persuasive Fogg, BJ Fogg, Professor Persuasive, what am I supposed to call him, right? If you look at sort of go and look at his conferences, it's full of people who are doing those kinds of tools that are trying to do smartphone-based supporting behavior change, not just about collecting data at all, if anything about it. And the PTSD coach isn't about collecting data. It's entirely about trying to support self-care tools, which you could call a type of behavior change. Yeah.
So it sounds like a lot of this is based on behavior change and that initial use. I'm more concerned about getting past that novelty of the application, the novelty of how do we...
So I agree entirely with your question. I don't agree with the initial statement. So my fault if I gave that impression. So this is our intention is not for this to be about that initial use. The intention is for this to be about some sustained use. Things I forgot to say. In the sustain, but it's a very important question, right? So when you design thinking this through, you do have to initially design like what is actually going to be useful, even initially. And then you have to think, and there's a lot of work to be done. How do you sustain? So when I mentioned engagement and all those things, it's not hard to engage people for a little bit at the beginning, but how do you do that over time? And so a lot of these things, and this isn't all about behavior change. Some of this is just about helping to collect data that helps with your drug titration in your clinical treatment. But often this shouldn't be 365 days a year. It should be episodic, right? There might be passive things that are being collected that might notice that there's been some transition in your state. You've become more sedentary, you've become less social, or the opposite, and that triggers some perhaps engagement of a different form. So I think that's where there's such a rich array of work to be done on the HCI and user experience. Didn't emphasize that enough. It's all about that question of sustainability. But to be fair, UbiFit was about looking at sustainability, about sustaining engagement. It was how do you keep people, not sustaining engagement with the app, sustaining engagement in what they're trying to get them to do, which was physical activity. So that is absolutely right. It's not just about that, the flashiness of the initial of the initial app. And I have no profound or even not profound answer.